then to the scherzo and trio, which Beethoven starts to use more often in his symphonies and chamber works like string quartet and piano sonatas and so forth. But they're very similar in the construction as far as the way that the material is organized, but it has to do more with the tempo. This was faster, scherzo was a faster movement, and more with the contrast of the atmosphere, the mood. So the scherzo was more emotional, whether it was comical if it's in a major key, or if it was more dramatic in a minor key. That would be in comparison to the more, that sense of, self-imposed restraint of the minuet, something that's more graceful and, has more sense of elegance and not so much of the emotional, expression, intensity of expression. All right, so these two movements have specific forms associated with them. The second movement has more variety, as does the fourth movement. So I'm just going to put here same forms. As the second movement. And so you see a variety there. But basically, it's those three forms that you'll find. So I want you to be able to talk about tonal architecture, to talk about open and closed forms, to talk about the way that Baroque composers approached form, and examples of open and closed types of forms in the Baroque period, and then also to make a comparison in general with Baroque composers and classical composers in the way that they approached form using the terms open and closed. Then to know the specific forms associated with the classical symphony, and then in general you should know that the 19th century then sees a less rigid approach to form than the classical composers. In general, Romantic composers take the forms of the classical era, but they use them in their own personal, individualistic way, and are more unique from one composer to the next, as compared to classical composers. So Mozart and Haydn have way more in common in the way that they approach form than someone like Brahms and Berlioz. So you're going to have a much greater sense of individuality in the 19th century. Yet they're based on classical principles. So we'll be looking at some examples of Romantic forms with some works by Brahms and Chopin, but especially we're going to look at Beethoven, because really you can see that transition from a classical orientation then into the 19th century Romanticism, and Beethoven is the great architect in music, and is someone that really establishes the possibilities for the way that this Western European art music, how it could be organized, and how it could express these deepest, most profound thoughts. All right, so what we're going to do next is to talk about the smallest units in music, and talk about the first 6 chapters of the textbook.